Hello YouTube, welcome back to another episode of the Card Combo Show with me, Chocobilly, where I look at the weird and wonderful card combinations in the Final Fantasy TCG. And this week I am going to be looking at forwards with entry or enter the field effects, but some interesting ones, not just your standard stuff. Right, so the cards I'm looking at this week are Chaos from Opus 16, Lightning from Opus 16, Enkidu or Enkidu from Opus 12, Vincent from Opus 16, and Heretical Garland from Opus 16. Right, first up we have Chaos, who is an 11 CP Dark Forward with the text, the cost required to cast Chaos, that's a bit of a tongue twister, is reduced by 2 for each element among characters your opponent controls. And when Chaos enters a field, your opponent selects one forward other than light or dark they control, they gain control of it. You gain control of it. And then Dull, put one character you control owned by your opponent into the break zone, choose one forward, break it. So, a fair few interesting effects there. So, the first to note is that basically Chaos will always cost you at least 9. So, unless they literally haven't played any cards or any characters onto the field yet, Chaos will be reduced by 2 for each element. And that does include multi-element. Now, this is another point for people to remember that the way that a multi-element is worded makes a difference. So if a card gains an element, it is additional to. If a card becomes an element, it overwrites its previous element. So for example, the Light Princess Sarah that comes onto the field, the 1 CP backup, when she comes into the field, she becomes the element. She doesn't retain her light element typing. So basically, this card becomes free when you play Shantoto, because Shantoto gains every element except for light and dark, I believe. At which point they'll reduce Chaos's cost by 10. So yeah, basically he becomes free. And then not by 10, by 12. I can do basic math. So Chaos can become free and punishes your opponent for playing multi-element, basically. And then when he enters the field, they select a forward. So it's kind of level in that way that your opponent gets to select the forward, but you know, at the end of the day, it's a select, so you could potentially play Chaos, then destroy the forward you don't want to take control of, at which point they are then forced to have to select the other forward. But what's really interesting about this card is that Chaos can dull and put one character you control that is owned by your opponent into the break zone. So if you can steal another of your opponent's cards through some other effect that isn't necessarily a forward, so a backup or a monster, you can actually break that with Chaos to break one of your opponent's forwards instead. So obviously combos. Magic Pot. So let's say you play Chaos onto the field, even if you pay 9 CP, you get to take one of your opponent's forwards. You then use Magic Pot to put Chaos into the break zone to then search another Chaos, bring it onto the field, and then you get to steal another of your opponent's forwards. Now obviously your opponent gets to select both times, but if they've got 2 forwards, maybe one crap, one good, you take the crap one first with Chaos, Magic Pot, bring out the other one, take the other one. So just really, really effective. And I mean, Chaos has still got quite a high cost, but the chances are he will probably be costing you about 7, which if you then include the Magic Pot cost isn't too bad, because you're getting to take 2 of your opponent's forwards and you get to keep Chaos at the same time as well. Layla. So the idea behind this is that you basically want to put your opponent in a position where they need to start playing forwards. So playing Layla into Vikings draws you more cards to hand and means that your opponent is going to have to play forwards, otherwise they, even though obviously most Vikings are pretty small, if they can't deal with them in one go, you're going to have lots of attacking forwards, which means your opponent's going to want to play some forwards. Now obviously with Chaos, your opponent gets to select the forward they play, but if you can retort by killing one and then playing Chaos, that's not too bad. What's also good though is the fact that the Vikings do draw you lots of cards, and Chaos isn't exactly cheap. So realistically, getting lots of cards to hand through the Vikings and be able to play Chaos and steal one of your opponent's forwards, then means that you've got even more forwards. So let's say you've played Layla into a Viking, into a Viking, into a Viking, then you play Chaos, and then you steal one of your opponent's forwards. Your field is now massive. So unless your opponent responds with a, let's say Shantoto, that's fine because you're still removing lots of stuff, but now any further Chaos will actually cost you 0. So not too bad. Althea. So if Chaos costs you 0 or even costs you a little bit less, then Althea to play Chaos, use Althea, bounce back to hand, play it again, steal as many of the forwards as you want. Just being able to bounce it. It doesn't have to be Altair, it can be Chocobo, it can be Bismarck. Just really the fact that you can bounce Chaos back to your hand, and the cheaper he becomes, the better he is. And if your opponent is playing multi-element, and let's face it, multi-element is played a fair amount. So Sky Pirates, your opponent will probably have at least 3 elements, because you have the Philo backup, which can make your make the backups also generate fire, also generate water, and then there's the fire backups as well. So who knows? You know, there could be at least 3 elements there, but there's lots of multi-element decks out there. If it were to come up against, say, the Soiree members, again, would cost or reduce the cost by quite a bit. So be able to play it for quite cheap, bring it back to your hand, do it again, steal as many forwards as you want. Zidane. So this is where the fun begins. I hate this card as well, I know, but ultimately be able to play Zidane and steal your opponent's cards and put them into the put them onto your field. Now, let's say you play Chaos and Chaos steals on your opponent's forwards, and then your opponent responds by breaking that forward. Zidane, if he were to, say, steal a backup from your opponent's deck, you can play that onto the field, and then you can use Chaos's Dull effect to put that backup into the break zone to then break one of your opponent's forwards as well. So the worst card you can get off of Zidane is probably a 2CP backup, unless you're playing Zidane quite early, which, to be fair, is going to happen a lot anyway. But still, getting a card, or maybe even a monster, onto the field that isn't that great would suck. But then being able to play it onto the field, and then using Chaos's ability to then break that card, and then break another opponent's card, is actually pretty decent. Now, obviously, you want to be mindful of the fact that Zidane isn't the only card that can do this. You could also run this with Mind Flayer, or potentially Lanny as well, and Mind Flayer and Lanny actually get the cost reduced as well, so maybe it's worth paying the extra 2CP for those cards just to be able to probably get something a bit more expensive but cheaper, if you know what I mean. And Go-Go, because use Chaos, put something they own into the break zone to then break their forward. Go-Go is there, you get to break another forward as well. So let's say your opponent's got 3 forwards, you play Chaos, you get to steal one of them. Following turn, you play Go-Go, you then use Chaos' ability to break the forward you stole, to then break another forward they have, and then Go-Go will kill the other forward. So you've just broken all 3 of their forwards. Right, Lightning. So, she is a 3CP 7k water forward. When Lightning enters the field, choose one forward. If the number of forwards your opponent controls is greater than the number of forwards you control, remove it from the game. And then switch Schemata S, remove Lightning from the game. Play Lightning onto the field until the end of the turn. A very powerful card. With some interesting outfit. It's, I think, from Lightning Returns, and there was some pre-ordered DLC. One of them was for her to look like Yuna, the other one I think was Cloud. But yeah, but either way, a really, really strong card. So Kadaj. Kadaj is a great card to run with Lightning, because Kadaj has this weird effect of not being present whilst also pressuring your opponent. So coming at the end of their turn, removing things, potentially dulling something out, and then being able to attack means that your opponent really wants to get a couple of forwards onto the field. Now, obviously, Kadaj will enter at the end of your opponent's turn, so will work against Lightning in that regard. But if Kadaj puts on the pressure that your opponent plays more cards, or more forwards even, to then play Lightning to get to remove one of those cards anyway, it's not a bad thing at all. Bismarck, so all about the bounce. It might be a case that you want to bounce something back to your hand to then play Lightning, so that Lightning actually will, or when Lightning resolves, she will actually have the right amount of forwards. But what's even better is the fact that, let's say your opponent has 2 forwards, and you have 1 forward. You play Lightning onto the field. Lightning will target that forward, or target a forward on your opponent's field. Now, when she goes to resolve is when she checks with, when she resolves is when she wants to actually remove the forward. But what you can do beforehand is bounce her back to your hand, or bounce the other forward back to your hand. At which point, when she does come to resolve, you will have less forwards than your opponent does, so you then get to remove that forward. So you can bait something out of your opponent, and they might be like, no, sure, I'm not going to protect my forward because we've got the same amount, thinking that you messed up. And actually, you can then bounce Lightning back to your hand, either by using Bismarck, Chocobo, or using her own S ability, because she can remove herself from the game, and then you get to remove that forward anyway. So not too shabby at all. Chadley, because her S ability is actually really good. So if you're getting overwhelmed by your opponent, and they've got a lot of cards, or a lot of forwards on the field, and you just get lightning onto the field, remove something, then Chadley to use the S ability again to remove something else, and then hopefully Chadley to get back once more. And Chadley is in lightning, and most of the lightnings are in lightning. So, you know, you might be running just a lightning deck and making use of this little water card because it is strong. Snow. So another way to be able to pressure your opponent. They might have a few forwards down, but ultimately, if you're attacking with, let's say, Al Cid, actually no, because that'd be lightning ice, but either way, you know what I'm saying. You attack with an ice forward, you get to dull something out of the way, maybe dull two things out of the way, so your opponent wants a lot of forwards so that they're not taking points of damage and they have something to block with. When you do attack, you then play lightning, you have less forwards than they do, you get to remove something. Scale Toad, and just more ways of kind of pressuring your opponent. So it might be a case of they're playing forwards, or you using Scale Toad so that they're having to ditch their hand. No one really wants to do that, and there are two ways that you kind of deal with cards like Scale Toad aside from breaking it. It's either you just make sure that you keep your hand huge, that Scale Toad will make you discard and it doesn't really affect your hand that much, or you just keep on playing cards. And most decks consist of forwards, or mostly of forwards. So the best way to do that is, aside from casting summons repeatedly, which if they're not hitting anything isn't really worth it, is just by repeatedly playing forwards. So then they're having to play forwards because they don't want the cards to be discarded out of their hand, and then you play lightning to remove those forwards anyway because they've had to play lots of forwards, and you get to remove them because, yeah, you get one going with this. Golbez. So just stealing your opponent's forwards. Now the weird thing about Golbez is the fact that you steal your opponent's forwards and then lightning will be removing them. So actually what you're doing is working against the count that lightning wants to be high. But what you can do is use Golbez to put your own forwards into the break zone, steal one of your opponent's forwards, and let's say you put Golbez and another forward and then two backups into the break zone. Your opponent now has two forwards, you have one, you then play lightning onto the field and then use lightning's S, and you get to remove another forward. You've stolen one of their forwards, you've still got lightning on the field, and you've removed one of their forwards as well. Potentially two. You know, there's just lots of different ways of being able to adjust your own forward count while still being beneficial to you by gaining control of one of their forwards, or ultimately just screwing with their deck anyway. And then Layla, because Layla into Vikings, then using Golbez to put Vikings into the break zone to then draw you some more cards, taking control of your opponent's forwards, and then, yeah, just like I said before, playing Layla is a good way to be able to get your opponent to play lots of forwards, and then you use Golbez to put those forwards into the break zone, you then play lightning as well, just, yeah, lots of fun. Alright, Enkidu, a 3CP 7k wind forward with the text, when Enkidu enters the field or attacks, deal 1000 damage to all forwards your opponent controls. And then Hurricane S, choose one forward, deal damage equal to its power minus 1000. So, yeah, it's an alright card. Actually, it's not even alright, it's not very good at all. The fact that he deals 1000 to all forwards is nice, I guess, but you might as well just run Dancer because it's probably more reliable. 6 around for longer, but the Hurricane S is a good ability. To be able to deal basically something's entire power in just a discard is really good. So, Mumba is kind of funny. So it's kind of like Enkidu's S ability. So choose one forward, deal damage equal to its power, minus 1000. So you could attack with Enkidu and then use Mumba instead of Enkidu's S ability and kill it, hopefully. Then Cryo. Now this will be quite fun. So you attack with Enkidu and deal 1000 to all your opponent's forwards. You then use Cryo's Spellblade Thunderer, which is just an S and a lightning. Choose up to 2 damage forwards, break them. So you will have to have a little bit of multi-element in there, but you're an Earth, so that's not a problem at all. So realistically, just being able to attack with Enkidu and then potentially break 2 forwards as well is really, really good, because they just have to be damaged. Now, obviously, your opponent might have some form of damage mitigation, at which point you need to kind of take those precautions, but ultimately, just being able to break 2 forwards with an attack and an S isn't the worst. Manasvin Warmech, so you can increase the damage that Enkidu will do, so you can make it so that the damage he does on attack or entry would be 3k, or you can make it so that the damage his S ability will do will actually be 1000 more than a forward's power. So if a forward is 8k power and uses S ability, it will actually do 9k power, which is kind of funny, but yeah, because it states that it'll be its damage reduced by 1000, but then the damage power buff gets added afterwards, at which point it then becomes more than, so it's just a bit wonky the way it works, but ultimately you can use Mana Twin to make it so that Enkidu is an insta-kill, which for 1 fire and a discard is actually pretty good in my opinion. Anima, so just another way to be able to work nicely with the Hurricane S. It's just pay 0, choose a forward, deal it 2000 damage, and then use Enkidu to then deal it damage of its power minus 1000. You get to break something, at which point Anima will then dull out another forward as well, which ain't too bad. And Chadley, because again, the S ability is really good. If an S ability is good, just include Chadley, because having those to hand will be really good. Vincent. So when Vincent is a 3 CP 7k ice forward with the text, when Vincent enters the field, choose one backup. As long as Vincent is on the field, it does not activate during its controller's active phase. So kind of like an Une from Opus, I don't know, 4, can't remember. And then Chaos Saber S ability. Till the end of the turn, Vincent gains plus 2000 power. Vincent cannot be chosen by opponent summons or abilities, and if Vincent is dealt damage by a summon or ability, the damage becomes 0 instead. That's quite a mouthful, but basically it's a form of protection, which is always nice. But yeah, it's an interesting card, and being able to lock down that one backup that might be problems, so let's go, I don't know, Tyro or Kuchaspel, those heavily played cards that will potentially screw with your deck, are great to get locked down, but you do need to protect Vincent, hence the S ability. So Cecil, another great way to protect your Vincent, but also kind of screw the deck. So thankfully this is the right element combo actually to kind of do tax. So you could have something like Cecil on the field and Vincent, and then maybe, I don't know, let's go with some discard, and then the old Sid, I've forgotten his name now, but the one that goes with the remedy, and then there's Babus as well. But basically you make it so that your opponent's got one less backup because of Vincent, but then when they try to target Cecil or anything, then they have to pay 2, at which point they're losing more backups or discard from hand. Which, so basically Vincent and Cecil, and then maybe something like Scale Toad or other tax mechanics, mean that your opponent's going to actually struggle to even pay for Cecil's S ability, pay for his auto ability, because they don't have any resources, which is horrible. Leviathan, so this is quite amusing. Just being able to play Vincent to lock down a backup is nice, but then let's say your opponent wants to use an action ability anyway. So when Vincent enters, he will make it so that backup doesn't reactivate, but that doesn't mean it goes dull. So it might be a case of they're saving that, they'll save that backup, that Tyro or whatever, for when they really, really need it, and then they use it, at which point you cast Leviathan to cancel it anyway. So yes, they were damned if they do, damned if they didn't. But it's just a funny way to be able to kind of fake out your opponent, so they really have to think about, or try, they really want to get that backup online. So something like Althea, for example, and then you Leviathan anyway to cancel it, and they were screwed. School. It's just not a good card, but I like it because I love Final Fantasy VIII, but it's not a great card. But still, so he gains 1000 for each dull character your opponent controls. So with Vincent, it would mean that he at least becomes a 7k with first rate. That isn't the worst thing in the world. And then, you know, he also dulls all the backups when he attacks anyway, so he already becomes strong on attack, but it means that he's a bit more defensive. So if you were running, say, Vincent and Duglog with Squall, at least he can potentially become an 8k first striker. It's not a great combo, I admit it, but I'm just trying to make this card good because I like it. Yuffie, a card that often gets forgotten about, but she becomes free when Vincent's on the field. So you play Vincent, you play Yuffie. Vincent's now an 8k with Brave, which is, that's fine, to be honest. It's just another blocker with Yuffie as well if you really want to, but it just means that Vincent becomes a little bit harder to kill, and he's got Brave as well, so he is also an attacker and a blocker. Scale Toad, yeah, as I mentioned before, just making it so that your opponent can't really pay for anything, so they're discarding cards from hand. That means they can't pay for things like Cecil's ability, but they also don't have any backups either, so just finding ways to make it so that they literally can't play anything. And finally, Heretical Knight Garland, and probably, I'm not certain, but maybe my favourite card of Opus 16. So, he is a 4 CP 8k Earth forward with Brave, and when Heretical Knight Garland enters the field, choose one forward other than Heretical Knight Garland you control. As long as Heretical Knight Garland is on the field, it gains plus 4000 power and Brave, and then you can pay 2 Earth and 2 colourless to dull him, and he cannot be broken until the end of the turn. So his ability is okay, but it combos well with a few different cards out there that I think is actually really, really strong and a lot of fun. So, Ursula. monks are going to be very much a thing in this video. So yeah, playing Heretical like Garland onto Ursula means that she immediately becomes a brave 9k. So you no longer have to worry about breaking a monk with Ursula's ability to then make her big, to then break another one to kill something. Now you can just straight up kill something. And if you're running this alongside, you know, other buffers as well, so that Ursula becomes even bigger, it means that Ursula's just going to be nuking stuff left, right, and center. Vargas. So, when Vargas attacks, choose up to 140 opponent controls. If Vargas has 10,000 power or more activated, and it gains, if possible, this forward must block until the end of the turn. Vargas will be a 11k brave, so Vargas attacks, forward stands up, gets blocked, Vargas kills it. Nice. Simple as that, really. It does mean that ultimately Vargas will never actually really get to deal a point of damage, unless your opponent has no forwards. But it's still quite amusing. And what I like about this as well is the fact that even if your opponent kills Heretical Knight Garland to try and get rid of Vargas' ability, that will actually still buff Vargas. So he will then gain the plus 3,000 power from his own ability to then become 10k, to then still make something have to block when he attacks anyway. Alphino. So when Alphino attacks, dull all the forwards with a power equal to or inferior to Alphalord's your opponent controls. So he would become a 9k, so Alphalord attacks anything that's a 10k above gets to stay outright, but that's not many cards, so you get to dull basically everything when you attack with Alphino. Not too bad. And, you know, Scions, Earth, Lightning, works well together. Ramza. So if Ramza has 10,000 power or more, Ramza gains haste, and when Ramza attacks, choose one forward, of course 3 or less your opponent breaks, your opponent controls, break it. So, I mean, it's a kind of a niche amount of cards that he can break, but still really strong. And if he's doing that every single time he attacks and he's brave, so he's a big old blocker, it means that he is quite the threat for your opponent. Noctis. So, yeah, Noctis, it used to be a heavily played card back in the day, but not so much anymore. So, when you receive damage, choose up to 140 opponent controls. Noctis and the chosen forward deal damage equal to their respective power to the other. So, it's actually a good way to get around cards that cannot be dealt damage through abilities, because Noctis is dealing battle damage to the other forward, and vice versa. So, making it so Noctis becomes an 11k forward means that forward would have to be huge for it to kill Noctis and to not be killed by Noctis. Now, obviously, it wouldn't be too hard for your opponent to then probably cast something to finish Noctis off, but at that point, you could use Noctis' effect to make it so that he doesn't or isn't dealt damage. You obviously could just have, you know, summons in hand stuff to make it so he doesn't die or whatever, but ultimately, he just becomes massive, and you know, it's when you receive damage as well. So the fact that you've got Heretical Knight Garland and Noctis, 2 big brave forwards, and then they might have something like, I don't know, Behemoth K, where they can deal you damage without having to, well, still have to attack, but, you know, if you are on 6 and they did that, and, yeah, it's screwed anyway. But it just means that if they have other means of dealing damage, they're still probably going to lose a forward because Noctis and Heretical Knight Garland. Leon. So, yeah, when a forward of 10,000 power or more you control attacks, draw 1 card. I mean, it's not hard to do that in the Warrior Rebel deck anyway, but just making it so that potentially Leon just straight up becomes an 11k anyway. Draw a card every single time he attacks, plus other forwards doing things as well. It's not too bad. Aerith. So, Heretical Knight Garland buffing a forward, and then Aerith buffing everything by 2k as well. Maybe you could run this with Leon, actually, because you could have Heretical Knight Garland would be a 10k, and Leon would be a 13k. Every time each of those 2 attack, you get to draw a card, which is pretty good. And not to mention all the other forwards that might gain draw your cards as well in the attack as well. So, but yeah, either way, just being able to buff everything by massive amounts is really good. And Aerith has the little recursion ability on her as well. Really slow, but it's there and it's nice. So both Aerith and Heretical Knight Garland kind of have their own defensive mechanisms, even though neither are particularly great. But just making your forwards massive means that you have at least a chance of not dying to lots of field wild damage, for example, which is very much a thing at the moment, and blocking and potentially killing stuff as well. And Sophie. Oh look, 1 card that can make Sophie go immediately to 10k. Cool. Yeah, she becomes an 8k through Heretical Knight Garland's effect, and then through her own effect, as another Earth forward, goes to 10k. Just Sophie on the field, you play Heretical Knight Garland, becomes a 10k, pass turn, deal a point damage, draw. Obviously, you can only have 1 card or 1 Sophie in your deck at a time, and if your opponent can get rid of her, then that's that. You have to bring her back onto the field. Now, hopefully she doesn't get removed. But yeah, still a fun little ability. Opus 16 is a bit of a double-edged sword for me because it's got some really, really fun cards that do some really interesting things like Chaos and Heretical like Garland. But on the flip side, it's got too many meta-relevant cards. I don't mean meta-relevant. I mean too many cards that can just stand on their own 2 feet in basically any deck and just rinse you. And that is kind of meta-defining. The problem is the fact that there are so many decks now, especially Wind, which are the same core 25-30 cards, and it means that there's no real variation. And whilst I like the concept of something like Soirees, it is very much a little self-contained machine that doesn't really require anything else. Now, it's good for new players because they can basically immediately have a pretty versatile, winnable deck. But it just means that when you go to tournaments and things like that, it's generally all the same thing. Now, I'm not saying that people don't play stuff out of left field and they come and win, because that definitely happens. It just means that the meta becomes heavily skewed towards these generically good cards. And yeah, there are a lot of generically good cards, but the fact that there's also power creep even, sorry, it means that those cards are just steaming ahead of how good other ones are. I mean, Zidane, in comparison to Lanny's basically unplayable at that point. I know she gets the -2 cost and stuff, but Zidane will win out every time, basically. So yeah, I really like those cards, but at the same point, I wish they weren't as powerful as they were, and they just... Wind doesn't need this much more. I'll stop whining. I'm sorry, I'll stop whining. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. Stay safe, be lucky, and I'll see you in the next video.